A state of emergency or emergency powers is a situation in which a government is empowered to be able to put through policies that it would normally not be permitted to do for the safety and protection of their citizens. A government can declare such a state during a natural disaster, civil unrest, armed conflict, medical pandemic or epidemic or other biosecurity risk. Justitium is its equivalent in Roman law, a concept in which the Roman Senate could put forward a final decree that was not subject to dispute yet helped save lives in times of strife. States of emergency can also be used as a rationale or pretext for suspending rights and freedoms guaranteed under a country's constitution or basic law, sometimes through martial law or revoking habeas corpus. The procedure for and legality of doing so vary by country. Under international law, rights and freedoms may be suspended during a state of emergency, depending on the severity of the emergency and a government's policies. Though fairly uncommon in democracies, dictatorial regimes often declare a state of emergency that is prolonged indefinitely for the life of the regime, or for extended periods of time so that derogations can be used to override human rights of their citizens, usually protected by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. In some situations, martial law is also declared, allowing the military greater authority to act. In other situations, emergency is not declared and de facto measures taken or decree law adopted by the government. Ems na qual questio, Article 4 to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, permits states to derogate from certain rights guaranteed by the ICCPR in time of public emergency. Any measures derogating from obligations under the covenant, however, must be to only the extent required by the exigencies of the situation, and must be announced by the state party to the Secretary General of the United Nations. The European Convention on Human Rights and American Convention on Human Rights have similar derogatory provisions. No derogation is permitted to the international labor conventions. Some political theorists, such as Carl Schmitt, have argued that the power to decide the initiation of the state of emergency defines sovereignty itself. In State of Exception, Giorgio Agamben criticized this idea, arguing that the mechanism of the state of emergency deprives certain people of their civil and political rights, producing his interpretation of homo sacer. In many democratic states there are a selection of legal definitions for specific states of emergency, when the constitution of the state is partially in abeyance depending on the nature of the perceived threat to the general public. In order of severity these may include: the state of emergency can be abused by being invoked. An example would be to allow a state to suppress internal opposition without having to respect human rights. An example was the August 1991 attempted coup in the Soviet Union where the coup leaders invoked a state of emergency. The failure of the coup led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Derogations by states having ratified or acceded to binding international agreements such as the ICCPR, the American and European Conventions on Human Rights and the International Labour Conventions are monitored by independent expert committees, regional courts and other state parties. The Constitution, which has been amended several times, has always allowed for a state of emergency to be declared if the Constitution or the authorities it creates are endangered by internal unrest or foreign attack. This provision was much abused during dictatorships, with long-lasting states of siege giving the government a free hand to suppress opposition. The American Convention on Human Rights, adopted in 1969 but ratified by Argentina only in 1984 immediately after the end of the national reorganization process, restricts abuse of the state of emergency by requiring any signatory nation declaring such a state to inform the other signatories of its circumstances and duration, and what rights are affected. State of emergency legislation differs in each state of Australia. With regard to emergency management, regions that have been affected by a natural disaster are the responsibility of the state, until that state declares a state of emergency where access to the Federal Emergency Fund becomes available to help respond to and recover from natural disasters. A state of emergency does not apply to the whole state, but rather districts or shires, where essential services may have been disrupted. On the 18th of March 2020, A nationwide human biosecurity emergency was declared in Australia owing to the risks to human health posed by the Coronavirus Declaration 2020 was declared by the Governor-General, David Hurley, under Section 475 of the Act. In New South Wales, the NSW Premier can, pursuant to the State Emergency and Rescue Management